Madame la Ministre, your country, France, is one of the countries leading the sustainable recovery effort in the EU and actually globally, and the country behind the One Planet Summit. So you are really uniquely qualified to tell us why should a sustainable recovery be an imperative for governments.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good evening to all of you. First of all, allow me to thank you for organizing this event. Thank you also for really putting emphasis on the key topic of a green recovery. If I understand well your question, Your Excellency, I think the question you've asked is really how to make the current crisis an opportunity to build a better future. One thing I'm pretty sure of, and this is what I feel from a lot of the French people also, and even European citizens, is that clearly the COVID-19 crisis has really challenged a lot of the certainties that we had. And the wake-up call is actually brutal. We must now, there's no other, we don't have any other, I mean, there's no other option but to accept that we need to change. Because one thing is certain, and this is clearly something that citizens keep asking for, is that we can never go back to the way things were. Saying that doesn't mean that we know exactly where to go, how to go, and what do citizens want to leave back. But one thing that we know is that if we look at past crisis, I think this crisis is closer to it's closer to where we were in 1945 than what happened in 2008 or in the 70s. So I think what we need is really, and I don't want to sound over dramatic, but frankly speaking, I think this is the closest comparisons to what I think we need is really a green Marshall Plan. I think we need a Marshall Plan of the 21st century. I think, obviously, the context is very different. So we need a Marshall Plan that is way bigger than the original Marshall Plan, which was only $130 billion at the time, which is huge. But we need more, actually, if we want to make a change towards a greener economy. I think we need the Marshall Plan, which is also broader, so that goes really to scale. We need a Marshall Plan which is more inclusive, both in terms of taking into account the social inequalities, but also inequalities between countries. And fourth, one of the key differences with 1945 is the fact that private companies are really on board and are really not only willing, but have a lot of the solutions. So we need to come up with a new type of partnerships, public-private partnerships, using public money in a different way to attract more private capital, using sort of blended finance way more. So I think this is what we need. This is for the global level. At the national level, the recovery plans must also reflect the green ambition. Green investments are the solutions if we are to make our economies more resilient, but also less exposed to external disasters. It will create more local jobs, but not only more local jobs, but also jobs that are less risky. Because if we are to support the same job as before, these jobs are going to be under threat. So we need to make sure that we invest in the right type of companies, jobs, and sector of the economy. I think one of the key ways of doing that is that focusing on investments that follow actions through a mix of eco-conditions and eco-incentives. For example, we should support decarbonation, in particular in the field of sustainable mobility, low carbon energy, building renovation, or economic breakthrough. Second, we need to invest way more in circular economy solutions. I think circular economy is absolutely key for sovereignty, industrial sovereignty, for job creation, and for the preservation of the environment. And third, will also focus on an industrial strategy that focuses and bring together the ecological, but also and the digital transition. I think this is really the way to go. This is at least how in France we view things and how we have organized recovery plans at the national level, but also at the European level, and how we view things at the global level.
I think, Your Excellency, this is very useful. And to pick up on what you said, let me just go to Lord Adair Turner and ask you, from the point of view of investors and companies, Lord Turner, what is the investment case for the sustainable recovery? And what opportunities does it represent for these investors and for these companies?
Well, thank you. Let me make 4 points which set the context for that. First, in the Energy Transition Commission, we are absolutely clear that we have to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Second, that we know how to do that the absolute core of any path to net zero, and therefore that informs what investors should be looking for, is the deep electrification of the economy. It's taking electricity from something like 25% of final energy demand today to 65% by 2050, with fossil fuels declining in that role equally dramatically. An increase in total electricity use across the world of 4 to 5 times. But the good news is that that is now possible far more cheaply than we dared hope just 10 years ago, because of the dramatic falls that have occurred, and we saw them earlier on the screen, in costs of producing wind or solar have dramatically reduced. Solar costs down by 85%, wind costs down by maybe 60%, battery costs down by 85%. And all that means that actually achieving is absolutely possible, and possible across the world. But the tragedy is, at the moment, we're not on a path to that at all. We are on a path to 3 degrees warming rather than 1.5. And that's because we're just not going fast enough. These technological trends are so powerful that I'm actually pretty confident that by 2100, even if we didn't have strong policies, we would have a zero carbon economy, but it would be 50 years too late. And we've got to use policy to accelerate the path. So coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, I think we've got to really use this as an opportunity to dramatically accelerate that pace of progress. And I would identify 3 crucial things. Massive investment in green electrification. That's the strategic long-term necessity. Strong investment in buildings and energy efficiency, because that's the thing that can create large amounts of jobs in the short term in the response to this crisis. And thirdly, investment in the key technologies we need for the future, which include electric vehicles, electrolysis of hydrogen, batteries, and a digital economy. So those are my 3 priorities.
Well said. Thank you very much. Mr. J. Collins, what do we need to do differently in order to sustainably recover? What should the private sector investors and the governments do better, collectively, together, to make this recovery sustainable?
Great, thank you. Well, let me build off on the Minister and Lord Turner's comments a little, both without repeating them, just reinforcing what they said, and particularly Lord Turner talked about tragedy, and Minister talked about the Marshall Plan, which I think is a great idea. You know, it's that boldness, it's the seizing the moment and the action of this crisis. Historically, we haven't done that well. You know, Michelle Walker wrote a book called The Gray Rhino, where she talks about how humanity tends to neglect these highly probable, highly impactful global threats. Even like with the gray rhino, when they're staring us in the face. And we just can't do that again with climate change. We can't do that with the social inequality threats that we're facing. I just reread Mark Carney's comments, Lord Turner. You mentioned this tragedy, but the tragedy of commons speech that he gave on climate change and short-termism. And quite frankly, how humanity tends to postpone through inaction today and place on future generations enormous challenges due to how we think about economic and political paradigms that are too short-term and in our face. So this long-termism will be absolutely critical as a context. And this tragedy concept that, to steal from Churchill, it's important to define the tragedy or the potential peril, but it's also, as Churchill did, defining the hope and the aspiration of where we're going, the promise, if you will. And without that, we don't get there. And so this path to more sustainable recovery is going to require both this bold action and a roadmap and an ambition. And the only way we're going to get there, like the defiance and resolve that Churchill showed, and again, the minister talked about the 1945 comparison, right? That is the challenge of the moment, to be unafraid to call a spade, to pivot, even if the SDGs are now seemingly further out and out of our range and ability to fund, to be more ambitious actually now in our aim. It will require extraordinary public-private partnerships of the likes that we've really only seen in war times. And we've lost the flavor of the multilateralism, and we've also not done what we can do in the paradigms of public-private partnerships. And to recreate those in ways that allow the private sector to do what it wants to do. Let me give a couple examples. So one of the things that is tragic in what we're seeing right now with this $30 trillion of investor capital that is searching for a home in the ESG space to put money to work is this cacophony, if you will, of performance metrics and sustainability data. The data is inconsistent, it's outdated, it generally lacks transparency. We don't have harmonized metrics around the world. In fact, there's a failure, quite frankly, of the global system across the board, rating agencies, ESG scores, governments, standard-setting bodies, and regulators to come together around common energy transition taxonomies, standardizing some of these scoring frameworks. And by the way, that may be done best by the scoring setters themselves without the regulators, but it's not harmonized. We don't have comparable and mandatory disclosure frameworks, and we certainly don't have shared KPIs to measure both financial and non-financial metrics that are consistent globally. So if you think of all these investors on the one side and the needs on the other, we have this metrics data wall between us that unless we solve that together as an ecosystem, we won't do what is my second point, which is we have to scale at speed trillions of dollars of funding to get this right. And the only way we're going to do that is to harness the capital markets. The capital markets have the size to go from that old Dr. Kim adage of billions to trillions. And in particular, as I think Lord Turner and others mentioned, this need to grab and harness the technology that is actually wind at our back. It is possible to invest at scale in some of the technologies in the sustainability space. We just have to do it at speed. And in the case of climate, with an eye to Paris aligned investment scopes. In the EM world, it's trickier. And one of the speakers mentioned the blended finance option. I think we should be appalled at how slow blended finance has really been scaled and utilized, particularly where the ESG investor tends to start with the developed world, with investment grade space. And with the tragic situation of debt and growth and sustainability in most of the deeper, poorest emerging markets countries, we're going to have to blend, meaning we're going to have to bring in grant and development funding into structures with the private sector to be able to mitigate some of the risk. Without that, and without those structures scaled, the private sector can't be expected and won't take the risk where it's often needed most. The private sector can with the right catalyst and risk mitigation structures, like blended finance, actually do more, actually participate, and actually contribute. Citi is working now with the Secretary General on the Global Investors for Sustainability Alliance. It's a group of 30 investors and corporations around the world that the Secretary General chairs at the CEO level, dedicated to accelerate the sustainable finance alternatives. And one of the things that's happened is it's a group of, say, $15 trillion of investment money, is as we've come together now to consult with the European Commission as they move forward with their European renewable finance objectives. That's an example, one concrete example of public-private partnership. Why? You take these global investors and consult with the European Commission in a way that allows for a balance between how to get the private sector there and what are the appropriate policy and regulatory frameworks that will get us there, whether it's brown taxonomy and the energy transition slope, whether it's mandatory disclosures, all of those things that will allow us to maintain the Paris objectives, but also do it in a way that is principle regulatory based and incentivizes the private sector to do the right thing. That type of collaboration is critical. And if we don't have more of that, again, I just leave you with this thought. You can have the best orchestra, instruments, and players in the world. And if you don't have a conductor, if you don't play together on the same sheet of music with the same timing, you just won't get there. And so unless we stop siloing and we start to orchestrate and integrate a lot of the extraordinary efforts that are being done, and we start to collaborate better between the public and private sectors, we just won't do this. But the hope is that is absolutely within our power, and we can do it.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. Dr. Molina, I need to excuse myself just for a minute because I'm told that Madame la Ministre, she needs to go to the Élysée Palace. So we need to ask her one last question before she leaves us, if you don't mind. Madame la Ministre, what is the role, picking up on what Mr. Collins said, what is the role of key platforms? Is multilateralism dead, or do we have still a use for key platforms like the upcoming G20, the COP26, the One Planet Summit? Can they encourage ambition? Can they coordinate this global recovery effort?
Thank you very much. First of all my apologies, because what I've been hearing from the speakers is I've been taking a lot of notes. It's fascinating. So I really apologize for having to leave the room. It's extremely rude. But thank you again for your question. So whether I think that multilateralism is still relevant, very much so. Whether the way it works is still relevant, I doubt it. I don't think that we need to sort of change all our global institutions. That's not what I mean. But I just mean that we need a multilateralism that actually delivers for people. Very often, it sounds very obvious, but I'm elected in the south of France, and when I go back to my constituency, I always really struggle to explain why did I go to New York? Like, how did it make their life different? I'm being a bit like, I'm being a bit over, provocative here. But frankly speaking, I think we need to change the way we work at the global level. And I think it can go along the lines of exactly what Mr. Collins has just said. We need to come up with new ways of collaborating. One of the things that is really, really obvious and that really strikes me is that over the past decades, we have been extremely bad at collaborating. So now what we need is extreme forms of collaboration. So blended finance is one, but it is also, it could be used. I'm not going to get into the, peace building and because this is too far from what we're working on and talking about right now. But I think this is the types of extreme collaborations that we need. We also need, I think, to find a way of rethinking, and I know this is huge, and I know this is almost a taboo, but I think we also need to rethink the IP system, because at some point we will need to share new technologies and what is behind. So what sort of platforms, how do we collaborate to make sure that private companies can still have the return on the massive investments that they've made in innovation, while at the same time sharing more broadly and with poorer countries the innovation that they have come up with. And so what we're trying to do with the One Planet Summit that President Macron came up is really to identify critical sectors of the economy where, through different forms of collaboration, we can actually have an entire system or an entire sector of the economy actually just get to a tipping point and get into sustainable development. Just to give you an example, it's going to sound very trivial, but for example, the fashion industry. So you're going to say, why the hell is she talking about fashion? Is it because she's a woman? No. The fashion industry is the second largest polluting industry in the world. Everywhere in the world, it is actually destroying nature. There is no other word. No other word. Destroying nature. So what are the instruments? How do we work with private companies? What is the role of the private sector? How do we bring together at least 25 to 30% of the private companies of a particular, of the fashion industry, of the fashion world, to actually join a coalition where they make commitments, where they commit to doing more? And so this is what we've done. We've brought 30% of the industry to actually make ambitious commitments to reduce pollution, to invest also in nature-based solutions. And because what we've seen is that if we get 25 to 30% of the sector of the economy, then the entire sector actually can become more sustainable. Because what it means is that the 70% who haven't joined the movement towards a more sustainable and more ambitious in terms of sustainable development, we can actually finger point them, saying, hey, you're not doing your homework, you're not doing enough. And the remaining 30%, we can actually use them to show to other countries around the world that actually now is the time to regulate. That way, we go faster than through traditional diplomatic ways of working. It's the same on plastics, the same on green, on a whole set of green technologies. Anyway, I don't want to be too long. I think I spent way too much time on the fashion industry, which was absolutely not my objective. But I just wanted to make it a point and show that we are actually currently working through the One Planet Summit and the One Planet Lab on concrete ways of changing the way we work at the global level, because we need to show concrete changes in people's lives. Otherwise, they will stop tolerating all these big international institutions that actually fail to deliver for people.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your very valuable contribution. I hope that we will see you in Riyadh in October, when you can elaborate more on the Marshall Plan and on what you just said. You can be the best conductor that Mr. Collins suggested. Thank you very much. Good luck to you. Dr. Molina, if I may turn to you. You are one of the leading figures behind the effort to close the ozone hole, one of the global environmental successes of the 20th century. What are the lessons learned from that success? What do they mean for how we should deal with the climate change challenge?
Well, I would say the main success story is that the problem, excuse me, the problem with stratospheric ozone is a global problem. It doesn't matter which country is emitting the industrial substances that affect it, because they get mixed in the atmosphere. And that's what happens also with climate change. That's a very big challenge that we have. It is a global problem. It doesn't matter where you make the emissions, it affects the climate of the entire planet. But the very important point of the stratospheric ozone layer is that we do have one example that did work very well. The countries of the world got together, and of course they had to negotiate and do all sorts of things, but eventually through the Montreal Protocol, all the countries in the planet agreed to solve the problem. And that actually happened in spite of there being big differences, the rich countries emitting a lot more and so on. They even came up with a financial solution to help developing countries to participate in this accord. And it's working very well. It's just that these chemicals, we are still seeing the effects of those emitted in the 20th century, but it's very clear that the problem is practically solved. There are a few imperfections that are being found and so on. But the big difference is that for the stratospheric ozone problem, we only had a few very large industries, maybe 5 or 6 large chemical industries. At the beginning, they, of course, didn't want to participate to be part of the solution. And so that's what we are listening now. We need to do the same thing with the climate issue, except that, of course, fossil fuels is a much broader component of the economy than used to be the case for the fluorocarbons, the gases that affect the ozone layer. But I am optimistic because we do have this one successful example that the countries of the planet can get together. Now, just mention 2 things, if I may, briefly. There have been many meetings through the United Nations, as you know, UNFCCC and so on, to see how to deal with the climate issue. Fortunately, after many years, the Paris Accord was successful. So that means we do have a global agreement. It's just not good enough to solve the problem. The second point I want to make, if I can leave it on here on the table, is that in the scientific community, I belong to this community who work with Europeans, with Americans, with Latin Americans, anyhow. But the consensus a few years ago was that we had underestimated the impacts of that society would feel from not dealing with climate change. And that's why, starting something like 2 years ago, we decided to declare a climate emergency. So we're no longer in the same world we were talking about a decade ago. We are now in an emergency situation. I agree, Lord Turner already mentioned one of the goals is by 2050, not to have any more emissions of greenhouse gases. That's a very demanding aspect of this climate emergency that we have. And that means that we no longer have many decades. The goal is just in one more decade, by 2030, to have reached the maximum in emissions and then to start decreasing them. And the point is, just to summarize, is that fortunately with the technologies the way they have developed, we can do it. It's possible to boost the economies of the entire planet, to try to deal with the poor countries, which is a very big challenge. And because with the new technologies, it can be done without doing economic sacrifices. That's very important. But we're not there yet. We have the sustainable energies. Yeah. But anyhow, we still have a lot of work that we need to do.
Thank you very much. We have a short video. We have a short video to play where 2 young people will ask a question each. Can we please play the video and then I'll come back to the panel?
Due to COVID-19, we have seen a recent drop in global oil prices. This is an opportunity to revisit the policies, promote enabling technologies, and build financial arms to redirect resources to move away from fossil-fueled economy towards more greener economy. Now, what supportive policies will you put in place to mobilize the green grassroots micro-enterprises, especially in the green transportation sector that has been hard hit because of the pandemic?
Around the world, youth climate movements have joined the global call for racial justice. We know that Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color are disproportionately affected by the climate and biodiversity emergency. And since there can be no climate justice without racial justice, what will you do to advance environmental and digital solutions that center racial equity?
These are the questions from two of the youth, global youth. I just want to go back to the panelists, each one, for just one sentence, if I may, because we are running out of time. What would you advise the upcoming G20 summit in November in Saudi Arabia about the recovery, the green recovery? What would be your one in Riyadh in November? Lord Turner?
Commit to net zero emissions by 2050 and invest as heavily as we can across the world in electrification of our economy and zero carbon electrification of the economy. That's the vision that we have to have.
Thank you. Dr. Molina.
I agree with Lord Turner on this. I would add that society must consider measures such as putting a price on emissions, putting a price on carbon emissions as a practical means to really force all the different countries to comply, because that it's feasible. The idea is to let each country decide how to deal with it and so on. But at the moment, these are externalities where it's the cost to society of letting climate change impact us is much larger than the cost to the economy if we do it properly.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Collins, what would be your advice?
So first and foremost, I already gave it, which is that globally we have to have harmonized standards, metrics, disclosures, and while every country rowing their own boat in different directions just isn't going to get us there, and the G20 has to provide some of that leadership, whether it's one global standard setting body, whether it's the coordination frameworks that take the discord out of that system. Absolutely critical that that there is a more coordinated, harmonized approach, and that we get to this, what was said before, a price for carbon, that we have a net zero objective and a energy transition process toward Paris. And finally, one of the questions that was so aptly asked by the students in terms of measuring sustainability, not just green. Let's go back to the SDGs, dust off the sustainability ambition, and embrace, as the question implied, the digital surge that has happened through this COVID crisis to put technology to work all the way down to the last mile to deal with some of these inequalities. Technology can close the funding gap. It can speed the time to impact of the sustainability goals, and with the right framework around it, so that it's used appropriately, it can be funded to scale with great purpose and impact.
This has been an exceptional panel. Thank you so much for your contribution, for your thoughts, and for your advice. Thank you once again.
No, thank you.